And the thing was that for me, as someone who'd grown up in particular campaigning on climate change, there was a sort of eerie familiarity to some of this, because climate activists too used to be all very much about facts and data and evidence and assuming that was enough to win. Back in 2005, this is what passed for a story in climate activism. As far as we were concerned, well, we've got the science on our side, so it's case closed. What else is there to say? And initially, it seemed like that theory of change was working pretty well. Back in 2008, you'll remember we had a presidential election between Barack Obama and John McCain, both of whom agreed that climate change was real, that humans were causing it, that it was urgent to do something about it. Prospects looked really good for bipartisan climate legislation in the United States and for a big global breakthrough at the 2009 climate summit. What none of us in the climate scene had seen coming was these guys, the Tea Party, mobilizing for war from the right in the US, kind of besieging Republican lawmakers on town hall meetings or on talk radio, and just destroying any prospects for bipartisan climate legislation in the US because they had this resonant story about little guys versus big government. And again, it proved really, really powerful. But then if you fast forward 6 years to 2015, climate activists really learned their lesson. They learned that they needed to have resonant stories, that it wasn't enough just to have facts and evidence and data. And armed with those resonant stories and things like a kind of papal encyclical about climate change, really bringing that story to life, they achieved a breakthrough in 2015 in the way that had eluded them in 2009. So that really brought home to me the power of stories to drive or shut down transformation and collective change. So that's what the Myth Gap, which came out in 2017, is all about. And the starting point for the Myth Gap is to say that, you know, for as long as we've been around as humans, shared stories have been so important to us. Sometimes those are religious in nature, sometimes they're about heroes and quests, but myths in their different ways are all about deep truths of the human condition. They kind of tell us who we are, including holding up a mirror to the sides of our nature we might prefer sometimes not to think about. They tell us where we are and how we got here, where we might be trying to go. They're a bit like a kind of shared magnetic north, a compass that tells us what's important. And all the way through human history, we've had those shared myths until recently, because in modern times, and especially in the last kind of 5 decades or so, we've increasingly decided that things are either literally scientifically true or they're not true at all. So nowadays, if you look up myth in the thesaurus, you find it in the same entry as words like fabrication and fiction. And that's what creates this myth gap of the title. So here we are on one side of the divide with our kind of busy modern lives, and there over on the other side are the myths that used to unite us and give us a sense of meaning. And in the middle, there's this big gap. Those are just, those old stories are not part of our lives as much these days as they used to be. They're not that kind of force for unity in the way that once they were, which creates a vacuum, and nature hates a vacuum, so things flow into it. And in this case, it's what in the book are called anti-myths. They're the sort of stories that don't, you know, they fill that gap, but they don't meet those deep human needs that myths used to. So one example of an anti-myth is "you are what you buy," the story right at the heart of consumerism. And of course, if that seems like just a story, on the contrary, it has very tangible real-world impacts, because this is the story that drives overconsumption and leads to the environmental crisis we see all around us. Or take another really corrosive story that can flow into that gap, the story of kind of white supremacy, which has been so much part of this year as Donald Trump has eagerly kind of fanned those flames, and as we've seen a wave of protests mobilizing to oppose that story. And the importance of stories is especially acute, the book argues, in moments of shock or crisis, where it seems like things are falling apart and no one's quite sure what we can take for granted, what we can assume to be true. So the fall of the Berlin Wall was one moment like that. 9/11 was another, so was the financial crisis. And now, of course, right this moment, we're living through another one, which is COVID-19. And in these sort of crises, these sort of moments of great shock, it's it's very easy for kind of beliefs or fears to ripple through, if you like, our digital collective central nervous system, much like a wave of a murmuration of starlings kind of changes flight. So we've seen just in the last few months, stock market crashes immediately followed by waves of stock market exuberance. We've seen conspiracy theories like QAnon flourishing as never before. It's so easy for these sorts of things to take root when it's a moment of crisis and everything's up for grabs. And I think I always love this quote from Terry Pratchett, who said that people think that stories are shaped by people. And in fact, it's the other way around. What he really got is that stories create us as much as we create them, because they shape who we think we are and how we behave. So for example, take a bank run. Here's people queuing up outside Northern Rock back in 2007. That's when a story takes hold that there isn't enough to go around. There isn't enough money. And then people start to queue up for their deposits, and it makes the story come true. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So stories really matter because they create what we experience. Which brings me to the theme of political polarization, which is what the collective psychology really looks at. As we all know, politics these days is full of them and us dynamics. This graphic you can see here is a map of Twitter accounts in the United States, and it shows those oriented towards the Democrats, those oriented towards Republicans, and how they're very much in these two kind of separate worlds, barely talking to each other. So those are the kind of them and us dynamics that we see all around us. And actually, we're not as polarized on the issues as we think, but we are polarized in our attitudes to each other. It's what people call affective or emotional polarization, where politics moves into these two tribes and they're kind of yelling furiously at each other. The problem is that when we're up against issues as big as the ones that confront us right now, things like climate change or systemic oppression and inequality or mass extinction, these are too big as issues for us to overcome by one side defeating the other. At some level, we have to come together as a larger us rather than a them and us, because we just won't have the level of consent needed for transformative solutions unless at some level most of us are on board with the need for that transformation. So that is what the Collective Psychology Project is all about. It's about the psychology of how can we get more of us to both see ourselves and act as part of a larger us rather than a them and us. And one of the things we're really interested in at the project is the question of threat perception, of how people react when they perceive some kind of a threat. Because of course, one of the features of our news ecosystem at the moment is that there are lots of actors who have both the motive and the opportunity to keep us feeling threatened, to scare us or outrage us, because it's a really effective way of monetizing our attention. And what happens when we perceive threats, the thing that's hardwired into us, is the response that we call fight or flight. You know how that feels. It's a physiological reaction. Your heart beats faster, you start to sweat, your pupils dilate, you can feel a kind of adrenaline coursing down your arms. And that's a really useful reaction if you're being physically attacked by somebody. It's not a useful reaction in politics when we're confronting a century of shared threats like we are right now. Because fight or flight, it makes you selfish. It makes you concerned with your own physical safety. It doesn't make you more empathetic. It makes you less empathetic. So it's not the sort of thing you want kicking around in politics. Instead, what's a much more useful way of reacting to threats is what psychologists call tend and befriend. This is a behavioral reaction where you tend to yourself and your own safety and your immediate family group, but you also befriend people and create social networks that help you to do that tending. This is what we often see in the aftermath of disasters, where actually, contrary to the idea that it's always kind of a breakdown of law and order, people really come together and show amazing solidarity. And that's tend and befriend in action. So how do we keep people in tend and befriend rather than fight or flight? Well, this is where we get into what we call ABC, which stands for agency, belonging, and conscious self-awareness. So I'm just going to say a word about each of those before I finish. Agency, first of all, is about whether we feel powerful, like we have some sort of agency in our lives and our communities and in politics, or conversely, whether we feel powerless, which of course is a feeling that lots of people have at the moment. And when we do feel powerless, then we will go and look for agency. We'll try and sort of find a sense of power. And oftentimes we can do that in ways that are really problematic. People who get involved in far-right politics are often looking for a sense of agency. The people who were panic buying at the beginning of COVID-19 when lockdown was happening for the first time were also looking for a sense of agency, but in a selfish way rather than a pro-social way. Conversely, when we look at the COVID mutual aid groups that were happening all over the country and indeed all over the world during lockdown, that's a much more pro-social, helpful way of finding agency. It's a more larger us version of agency, if you like. B is for belonging. And this is really about whether we feel lonely and isolated, or conversely, whether we feel connected and valued and like we belong. And like feeling powerless, feeling lonely or disconnected is terrible both for our health and for politics. By some estimates, loneliness is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of its impact on life expectancy. And we also know that loneliness makes people less empathetic, more likely to go for extremist political views, and so on. And again, there's amazing examples of people mobilizing to fight loneliness, to kind of build those networks of friendship and solidarity, like this couple in London designed this form at the beginning of lockdown, posted it through all their neighbors' letterboxes, and built this whole network of belonging and connection where none existed before. So again, there's practical things we can do about this. And then C, finally, is for conscious self-awareness. What this is really about is whether we have the presence of mind to be able to choose how to react to stuff rather than our amygdala, the part of our brain that deals with threats, choosing for us and taking us straight into fight or flight mode. Now, some of this is about self-care. It's just about knowing how to look after yourself in stressful situations so that, you can tell if you're triggering and you're likely to start sort of, yelling at people or freaking out on social media, and you know how to kind of, manage your mental and emotional state and keep yourself in balance. But it's also, there's a big collective aspect to this too. And we've seen so much of this with the way that, again, conspiracy theories and fake news have flourished so much during coronavirus. Conscious self-awareness isn't just about managing your mental and emotional state. It's also about understanding how our own states affect other people's states and being really mindful of what kind of content, what kind of emotion are we putting out on social media into, as I mentioned before, that collective central nervous system. So to bring this all together, this is stuff that belongs right at the interface between both inner and outer, and between individual and collective. And when we think about the nature of change in the 21st century, and also about the effect that social media has in our lives, it's very much at the cusp of this quadrant, right there at the center. And the question I'd love to leave you with is, whose job is it to help us navigate this stuff that's both inner and outer, both individual and collective? Because historically, a lot of times this has been about the role of religion. Religion has always been at its best about agency, about pushing for change, about finding ways to do practical kindness in the world. It's always been about belonging, about creating congregations where people feel like they have things in common, even though they may be very diverse. And it's also about conscious self-awareness at its best. Religion teaches practices like prayer or meditation or philosophy that can help us to stay aware and mindful. But now, as religious observance is declining, we have this gap, and no one's quite sure whose job it is to help us build these crucial capacities in agency, belonging, and conscious self-awareness in a way that tends both to inner and to outer, to individual and collective. And I think the answer is this is a problem that all of us own. It's a kind of a challenge, but it's an especially interesting one in the technology context, because technology is so core now to our sense of identity, to our relationships, and to creating the kind of world that we're going to inhabit in the future, whether that's one that we're consciously choosing or unconsciously sleepwalking towards. So these are big questions for technology, which is why I'm super excited to have the chance to talk them over with you today. I'll stop there. Thank you again for having me.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So I might be wrong, but I could imagine that some of the, oh, there's a clap there from Terry. That like I feel like what we're doing with the fellows, and this is only our second session with them, is we're giving them quite a lot of different things, and probably expecting quite a lot of them to try and make sense of like, but what does this mean in relation to what we were talking about before? So it might be quite good just to start with like, have any of the fellows got thoughts in like what did listening to Alex kind of spark in you in relation to some of the stuff we've been talking about, or just some of the stuff you are thinking about anyway? You know, like obviously there's a really direct relationship between agency and some of the conversations we've been having about technology, but I just wondered, yeah, any initial thoughts about how this might link?
Yeah, oops, sorry, go on.
You go.
Cheers. Yeah, I was just thinking about your point that isolation kind of breeds lack of empathy. I found that really fascinating. Is that correct? So I get that right? Yeah. So one of the things we've been talking about was the inequality, the gap between the haves, the have-nots, and the haves in terms of tech, essentially, and connectivity. A large part of it is through technology and social media. So if the have-nots have not got that same connectivity, maybe that is kind of perpetuating isolation. And do you think that has some kind of impact, and that kind of allows the grounds for them to be vulnerable to groups and ideas that might take them in and make them feel part of a collective?
Cassie, do you want me to reply now, or do you want to take questions in groups? How would you prefer?
Do you want a few? Or do you want
happy to go with whatever you prefer.
I think Gabe's reply for that to that one would be great. And then, I mean, actually, if people have got questions, you could also just put them in the chat, and then I'll sort of read them out. You could type them in the chat, and then I can read them out too, or you can just say them. Alex, over to you.
So, I mean, I think, yeah, it's a really good question, Terry. I mean, I think, yeah, definitely there's a big digital divide, and that is a factor because, you know, I think where people are less able to access a diversity of news sources, they're more likely to sort of, you know, have kind of lower quality news sources. There's some data on that, and then it becomes easier for kind of people behind the scenes to manipulate public opinion. But then I think, you know, of course, even when people do have connectivity, that's not necessarily a cure-all, because, you know, it can be used in ways that